All right. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Wagner, and I am a program officer at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. We are thrilled today to host Yanzhong Huang for a discussion on his newest book, Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and its Challenge to the Chinese State. It's a fascinating look into the severe environmental problems that China is facing and its efforts to overcome them. And ultimately, this book paints a clear picture of a political system that is, as he says, remarkably resilient, but fundamentally flawed. So it's my pleasure to introduce the author and our speaker today. Yanzhong Huang is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor and the director of global health studies at Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Yanzhong is also a fellow in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program and a longtime friend of the committee. Now, as you may know, Yanzhong is an expert on many aspects of public health in China and is therefore frequently tapped to give his analysis on the COVID-19 pandemic. I just heard he's had over 500 media appearances over the last year, so you may have seen some of these. Now, while today's program will mainly focus on the content of Yanzhong's book, we will of course reserve some time to talk about COVID-19. Now, the topic of environmental degradation is not limited to China. As we think about China's role and how we think about the US working with China in the fight against climate change, we have to consider how, if what happened in Washington last week affects and will continue to affect the bilateral relationship. So we may or may not try to tackle that issue today if we have time. So what I'm going to do is ask Yanzhong to start with an introduction of why he wanted to write this book, and then give us an overview of the current state of China's environmental health situation. After that, I'll ask some of my questions, and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. As a reminder, you can submit a question at any time during the program using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you feel comfortable, please provide me your name and affiliation so that I can recognize you. And with that, Yanzhong, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's really a pleasure to speak again at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Please allow me to share the screen. In fact, I actually like to use this opportunity to thank many of the National Committee members who have contributed to the completion of this book project. Some of them, including Steve and Jane, were members of the CFR study group on China's environmental health. They provided very useful feedback on several chapters. And some of them have read the full manuscript and written blurbs for the book. And I owe a big thanks to many other the public intellectuals at the national committees, who offered help and support. And I forgot to mention that I like also to thank Margot for being extending the invitation, really, and organizing the event, in addition to Stephen. So Stephen asked this question, what motivated me to write this book? Well, essentially, I started this book project in 2013 when the smog suddenly became headlines in Chinese media. In fact, in January 2013, I believe, the readings of PM 2.5, that was, for those who don't know what PM 2.5 is, well, they are the fine particles in the air, that are smaller than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, and they're capable of causing serious heart and lung problems, at high concentrations. So they're considered the most harmful to health as an air pollutant. So the readings of PM 2.5 in January 2013 actually reached 40 times the maximum level allowed by the World Health Organization. Then when in February, there was this reports, that linked water pollution and harmful chemicals to serious health problems, including the emergence of several hundred so-called cancer villages. These are the communities where the rates of cancer are unusually high. So these events led me to think about the relationship between environment and health. But until that time, I found that analysis of this new policy field had remained relatively underdeveloped, segregated within the two separate sectors, environment and health. So that nurtured my interest to synthesize environment, health, and governance problems in China into one single and accessible source. Well, the second reason that motivated me to write this book is that environmental health issues and China's response actually serve as a springboard to examine China's state capacity. We have read the most studies on China's rising power. They tend to highlight China's economic prowess, military buildup, as well as its ability to project its international influence. But many fail to pay adequate attention to another important dimension of the state power. That is the state capacity to extract the resources, to mobilize those resources, to provide the public goods and services, to have its claim to rule voluntarily accepted by the people, and to enforce the rules, norms, and regulations across its entire territory. I want to, again, use that case to examine the health and non-health implications of China's environmental health crisis, and then the state's capacity to effectively respond to the crisis. If you look at this table of contents of the book, after the introduction, I have actually two parts. The first part is basically discussion of the health and the non-health impacts of the environmental challenges. The second focus on the government response. We talk about the evolution of the government environmental health policy, how the government enforce and implement the policy, which is followed by assessment of government policy effectiveness. So, now, I want to address that question before we talk about this policy process. In fact, that was several years ago when Jeffrey Sachs, who's the chair of that CFR environmental study group, he asked me this question, right? What makes the case of China's environmental health challenges so unique? Right? So I gave some thought. Here, the answer is that the scope, severity, complexity, and timing of China's environmental health crisis has raised its critical concerns about the ability of the Chinese state to cope with its complex internal challenges. First of all, let's look at the scope, right? We know that the China's environmental health challenge itself is not unique, right? Because the United States, Great Britain, right, Japan, right, they have all documented this effects of environmental degradation, on health. But the scope, severity, complexity, and the timing of China's environmental health crisis actually have reached another dimension. Let's look at the scope, right? Unlike many Western countries where air pollution is limited by locality and the duration, China actually has found air pollution to be a nationwide sustainable threat to health. Right? In 2013, for example, the smog affected 800 million people over a span of 540,000 square miles. Then you look at severity. Right? Air pollution, right, in some places of China was so bad, right, it went off the standard scale. Right? Even the worst polluted American cities would rank among those with the best air quality in China. That is what led James Fallows, the American journalist, to conclude that no one now alive has experienced anything similar in North America or Europe, except in the middle of a forest fire or volcanic eruption. And third, let's look at complexity, right? We have heard London Fog. we have heard about the pollution in LA, but unlike this pollution problems, China's air pollution contains a complex mixture of pollutants, right? As I argue in the book, what Chinese call wumei or haze is actually a mix of the London fog type particles and sulfates arising from fossil fuel combustion and Los Angeles smog type photochemical pollution occurring in areas with high visual traffic and sunlight. And finally, there's the issue of timing, right? When we talk about China's rise, we find the parallel American rise, but the United States did not face a major environmental crisis in its pre-World War II emergence as a superpower, right? China does not enjoy such a luxury, right? Its enormous environmental health problems present a major challenge to its global ambitions. So I'm not going to belabor how the policy involves in addressing these environmental challenges, but I want to highlight here the two, the policy enforcement and the policy assessment. The policy enforcement wise, we found that the government efforts to clean pollution basically focused on boosting accountability and increasing central authority, right? Through those policy instruments like environmental supervision talks, right? Central Environmental Protection Inspection, or CEPI. Don't get confused with the CEPI that is behind the COVAX pillars. That is the acronym for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. But the Central Environmental Protection Inspection is used to supervise local pollution control work. They also try to improve interdepartmental coordination through the campaigns. In April 2017, the Ministry of Environment began the largest inspection campaign on record, when it deployed some 5,600 environmental inspectors, to Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei region and nearby areas to check the compliance with the environmental laws and policies in the 28 northern Chinese cities. Right? The number of inspectors eventually increased to 7,000 in September. Right? So that was considered the time of the toughest air pollution regulation history. And those efforts actually were facilitated by the recreation of what we call the bandwagon polity under President Xi Jinping. Right? The bandwagon polity essentially refers to a situation when in the hierarchical society, the polity, you have all the major political resources actually concentrated, right, in a superordinate figure like President Xi. So that sort of changed the government officials' incentive structure. So they will jump onto President Xi's bandwagon to show their early and enthusiastic support of President Xi's policy agenda. So in that situation, this food dragging, and policy immobilism become rare, right? And they also have this policy enforcement tool, what we call institutionalized mobilization, that try to fix the problems associated with the campaign approach. In fact, we have seen China investing significantly in institutionalizing and routinizing those policy instruments introduced at the campaigns to tighten the grip of the party state. That is a pattern we call the institutionalized mobilization. Right? Through those means like party administration shared responsibility, the one post, two responsibilities, and under this, the party administration shared responsibility, local party leaders and government heads, such as like a mayor and the party secretary of the city, they could share responsibilities for pollution control in their jurisdiction. So these measures, appeal to take effect. This leads to our next the discussion on the policy effectiveness. Right? Is China winning the war on pollution? Right? It is very clear China has shown growing commitment to environmental protection. They have invested tremendously in the renewable energy. Right? Actually, more than 45% of the world's total investment in renewable energy happened in China. And also as a result of the government's assiduous efforts, the share of the coal in China's total energy consumption has dropped. Actually, in 2018, it dropped to below 60% for the first time. And then look at nationwide, the concentration of PM 2.5 also dropped, right? An average of 50%. From 72 micrograms per cubic meter in 2013 to 36 micrograms per cubic meter in 2019. That was a measure that took the United States approximately 20 years to achieve after its passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970. There's also an overall reduction in the percentage polluted days since 2012. If you look at the figure, which shows the percentage of days with mean average PM 2.5 concentration higher than 75, that's 75 micrograms per cubic meter, because if it's higher than 75, it categorized as a polluted day in China. So it is very clear there's an overall drop in the percentage of the polluted days. Well, the caveats here is that if you look at the progress nationwide, it is actually very uneven, right? In 2019, that is not covered in the book. The PM 2.5 concentration level actually increased in more than half of the cities. Air quality in 2019 improved in Beijing, Guangzhou, but actually getting worse in Xi'an, Shenyang, Chongqing, Tianjin, and Harbin. And there's this diminishing return problem associated with China's pollution control efforts, right? According to the government's data, in 2019, among the 261 cities that failed to meet the government mandated targets of air pollution control, the PM 2.5 concentration level dropped by 2.4% compared to the last year. That clearly shows that the speed of the drop of the PM 2.5 concentration has slowed. In fact, in Beijing, in 2017, the PM 2.5 concentration dropped by 16 micrograms per cubic meter. In 2018, it became 10. In 2019, it only dropped by 5. So again, this is the decreasing or diminishing return problem kicked in. And the third is that most of this improvement in air quality in some of the cities like Beijing, for example, occurred in the summer. In fact, if we look at if we look only at the PM 2.5 level in the winter, that is November, December, and January in a city like Beijing, the situation, it's barely improved, right? From 2012 through 2016. Most of the improvements in air quality occurred in the summer. In fact, winter pollution was getting worse in some Chinese cities. There is also an increase in the concentration of other pollutants, especially ozone, right? That contribute to, I think, 14% of pollution caused death. Right? There is an increase in the concentration of ozone, which actually the average ozone exposure in China rose by 17% during 2014 and 2017. That caused an estimated 12,000 premature deaths annually. And in 2019, the average ozone concentration rate saw a year-on-year increase of 6.5%. That indicates clearly the stronger petrochemical pollution. Right? And fourth, there's still if you look at the steel production and also coal production consumption in China, after the peak in 2014 in steel production, they dropped for 2 years, but then it rose again in 2017. Right? We have seen, look at this figure here, right? The steel output between 2001 and 2019, it is very clear, right? Continued to increase until 2014 here. Then started to drop, right? And it dropped for 2 years, but then increased in 2017. Continued to increase through 2019. The same is for the production, consumption, and consumption of core energy. You can see, well, initially we thought that the coal consumption production peaked in 2013 and started to drop, but since 2016, clearly increased again, right? The COVID-19 crisis actually threatened, the post-COVID economic recovery actually threatened to wear away the past gains in pollution control. In fact, we found that more construction permits were issued for coal-fired power plants in China in the first half of this year than in 2018 or 2019. And by May 2020, the concentration of 4 air pollutants, PM2.5, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and ozone all returned to or exceeded the monthly levels recorded in 2019. And according to a more recent report released by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, major industrial cities in northern China may not be able to fulfill these even lenient pollution targets set for this winter. And finally, I also want to discuss the unintended and undesirable policy outcomes associated with government pollution control efforts. Essentially, this campaign-based approach creates those perverse bureaucratic incentives, that produce those unintended outcomes. The first problem is what we call I don't have an actual term for that, but when you have those government targets quantifiable, and then you include in the performance evaluation for the government officials, right? You are going to encourage those local government officials to only pursue those quantifiable targets at the expense of others, right? So this shows the pollution level before and after the so-called 2 sessions, that is the People's Congress and the political consultative conferences at the local level. In fact, in 189 cities, right? In terms of air quality index, PM2.5, PM10, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. What we found here is that a significant improvement only occurred for indicators that are used as a yardstick to measure local government performance in environmental protection, such as PM2.5 and PM10. Right, when actually during the those 2 sessions period, because of the government campaigns, you saw immediate drop of the PM2.5 or PM10 level. Immediately it was followed by rebound of the pollution level. There was also no significant impact on other pollutants, such as ozone. Right, the ozone level actually increased during and after the so-called 2 sessions period. There's a second problem, what we call overshooting. That is sometimes we call this like the local government officials acting, like more Catholic than the Pope in a way. Especially when you have this this so-called bandwagon politics, right? The government officials compete, right, to sort of fulfill the government designated targets. Sometimes they just overshoot, right? In 2017, for example, when the government in Hebei initially planned to convert 1.8 million homes, right, in the province from the coal burning to gas furnaces, officials were so enthusiastic or so eager to comply that they actually promoted more than 2.5 million homes to make that switch. That oftentimes involves physically destroying, the people's coal stoves in the process, right? So this caused unintended consequences because increased demand for gas combined with its unexpectedly low imports of natural gas, left a large number of households without heat during the winter. And this campaign-style enforcement also tends to rely heavily on administrative fight in lieu of public participation and market mechanisms. That often fostered a non-scientific and heavy-handed approach in policy implementation. My book talked about in November 2018, this district of Taiyuan in Shanxi. It was the government imposed a blanket ban on burning coal, meant to force this local residents to adopt electric powered heating, right? But without access to coal, but unable to afford the new heating method, the local residents try to keep themselves warm by burning old furniture, discarded wood floors, dead wood. That sent up clouds of smoke that only worsened pollution in the city. The more recently, just the last month, I saw reports again in Shanxi and then also in Shanxi, the local government officials actually used cement to block those heated brick bed, right? This is the people used to keep warm in the winter in northern China. Although they have distributed this warming mattress pad, but people say, well, this warming mattress pad is only for people to sleep well, right? But it won't keep the temperature high in the room, So that is again another sort of unintended consequences of the campaigns. So I'm going to quickly conclude. Environmental degradation, well, this is not elaborated in this presentation, but I want to just talk about this. This is some of the main conclusions of the book. Basically, environmental degradation in China has not only brought a wider range of diseases and other health consequences than previously understood, it has also taken a heavy toll on China's society, economy, and the polity. And since 2012, the government has indeed enacted new laws, policies, regulations, action plans to tackle the environmental degradation problem. It has also introduced a number of new policy instruments seeking to align the bureaucratic incentives with central policy goals in the implementation stage. And it appears that the government has indeed started to turn the tables on air pollution. But again, the problems is uneven. The health benefits of pollution thus far remains limited and mixed. And the single-minded pursuit of pollution control has incurred unintended and undesirable consequences and outcomes on other policy fronts. So the case of China's environmental health governance, essentially, as Stephen said in the beginning, reveals a state that is remarkably resilient and fundamentally flawed. That actually has profound implications for China's future, both domestically and internationally. So with that, I'm going to stop there. Stephen?
Thank you so much, Yanzhong, for the very insightful presentation. It seems to me like the centralization of power under Xi Jinping has been sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you say there's been more interagency coordination, there's been some progress in reducing pollution, and above all, the issue of environmental health has been able to rise to the top of the agenda because of Xi. But on the other hand, you say that this centralization has resulted in strong incentives for officials to jump onto Xi's policy bandwagon, or at the very least look to Xi as a bellwether in order to minimize their own political risk. And as a result, there's much less flexibility and autonomy at the local level, despite the fact that local officials likely know more about their unique situation than the central government in Beijing. So since you've already done such an excellent job describing how this tension in the decision-making plays out between the central government and local officials, I want to ask you about the space for activism on environmental health issues in China. First of all, how has public participation changed in recent years? What does it look like today? And what forms of collective action have been most effective and not seen as challenging the legitimacy of the CCP?
Well, this is not covered in the presentation, but as you may have noticed, it's indeed covered in the book. We talk about the public participation, even though that is the mainly a top-down approach, but we found that the public participation, the role of the society, social forces have played an important role, in agenda change, in policy formulation and implementation. In one of the chapter on the policy evolution, I talk about how there's people in the public outcry and this sort of like this movement that I gauge, the PM 2.5 level for my country campaign actually forced the government to introduce the PM 2.5 in its the quality monitoring system. So it together with the U.S. embassy in China, I think played constructive roles in democratization of the pollution data. And in the policy implementation too, we have seen the NGOs, both foreign and Chinese NGOs, played important role, right? The margins, the environmentalist activist margins, NGO, played an important role actually to help the government to implement, to enforce the government regulations, but they took a very sort of what he considered like a constructive approach, right? By using the government data, they are not doing like not taking like confrontational approach with the government, but use the government, the official data, then create their platforms to show, that the real time, this the pollution situation, right? In this different areas, so it allows people actually to monitor, right, the implementation of the government regulations. But still, right, the civil society organizations, play the role remains, very much suppressed. That if you look at those, litigation, right, launched by the civil society organizations, most of that is still launched by the government actors. There's public pollution related public interest litigations, right? Most of that are launched by the government agencies, and only a very small percentage of that launched by civil society organizations. One of the reasons is that it's just too expensive, right? Just to collect the data, and then also if you lost in the lose the case, there's you need to pay really hefty, there's litigation fees. It's just for most of these environmental organizations in China remain very small. One of the largest, like Margarine's NGO, remain very small, just maybe a dozen people when I was conducting interviews in Beijing. That was considered like the largest NGOs environment. And certainly now, with the government, this crackdown, on civil society, the social control, I'm sure, their role, would continue to be, well, there's still a lot of room for them to sort of expand their influence.
So I want to move on a bit to ask you about the so-called Beijing consensus or the China model. Given the endurance of the CCP and the astounding economic growth under its rule over the past 40 plus years, some experts suggest that the authoritarian model is resilient and strong and perhaps a viable alternative to liberal democracy. How does authoritarianism, in this case in China, perform in the face of an environmental health crisis? And I ask this because so much of our focus in the US is on China's trajectory and the challenges it poses to us. Yet one of your conclusions in this book is that we are overestimating its strength, or at the very least, underestimating its weaknesses. So how should we factor in China's environmental health issues when discussing the party's trajectory and the strength of its political system?
Yeah, I like what you say. We are, in terms of the U.S.-China policy, the current one, clearly we sort of estimate their strengths and underestimate their weaknesses. But it is very clear, right, that the China's this authoritarianism is posing a challenge to liberal democracy. Certainly what that if you recall this event on January 6th, right? That the president of the Council on Foreign Relations today just published this piece in Foreign Affairs. He say, this damage wrought by the January 6th to U.S. foreign policy is great. The post-American world that is no longer defined by U.S. primacy is coming sooner than generally expected. But it's less because of the inevitable rise of others. I assume that means China, than because of what the U.S. has done to itself. I remember, right after the event, one China scholar, I don't want to name who that he or she is, basically said, that for the next 20 years, never talk about, democracy is superior to authoritarianism. That really hurt, not just the U.S. soft power, but actually tarnished the image of liberal democracy. And then, but you look at China's the so-called China model or Beijing consensus, right? It is indeed showing some very robust capacity, right, to attain certain goals in certain areas. They are also very good at adapting to the digital world, right? You have seen clearly, right, not just in the environmental control, but particularly, I think, in this COVID-19 pandemic, the government was very effective in terms of using, the digital means, by cell phones, big data, to monitor people's movements, to implement the draconian policy on COVID control, and also to use that to control this flow of the information, not to mention also the use that digital means as it's an effective tool for misinformation and disinformation. I think there is something that would make the authoritarianism, here to stay in the many years to come. Certainly about this effective surveillance and social control is facilitated by this digital means. But in the meantime, it has become increasingly difficult, to have an organized opposition, even among the elites themselves, against existing ones. But I think it is still, I think, wrong to say that China's authoritarianism presents a viable alternative to liberal democracy, right? I think for the following reasons. First, I think the legitimacy would continue to be a problem haunting the Chinese state because its inability to anchor its rule in solid public approval. That places less emphasis on performance and more on rule of law. The second, when these people's prosperity increase, right, the Chinese people are increasingly going to value the good health, other things that we have seen in this environmental control case, right? They're going to value things more than the basic earnings, right? So as a result, the gap between the popular expectations and the state's capacity to deliver these promised gains could only become larger and wider, right? So the lack of enlarged and institutionalized public participation, just as we have discussed in this policy process, actually widens the gap between policy measures and people's actual wants, needs, and desires. And thirdly, we look at this recreation of this bandwagon policy under President Xi. It has forced government officials to take speedy action, but this unrelenting reliance on campaigns, right, has also, we have seen again the environmental case, distorted the bureaucratic incentive structure that led to unwanted and undesirable consequences, right? Certainly we have other examples like population control, right? You've been state is so capable, so powerful, it even is able to internalize that population control behavior among the society. But when you lifted that policy, this policy, people, still would not give more birth, right? So it becomes now a big challenge for China to compete effectively, right, with countries like India because of that reduced population dividend. And finally, the health and non-health consequences of China's environmental destruction also serve as a reminder that, despite China's official statement on the superiority of their development model, it is still subjected to the same negative consequences, the dynamics, of countries that industrialized before it, did, and is paying an even greater price, for its pollution. So such a model, when exported to other countries, I don't think it's going to be popularized, as a best practice for governing environmental health or other development issues. So, I do believe, that again, authoritarianism still does not present a viable alternative to liberal democracy.
Thanks, Yanzhong. Let's shift a bit and talk about China's place in the world with regard to environmental protection. Two big headlines about China from the past year come to my mind. The first is President Xi's announcement that China will aim to be carbon neutral by 2060. But the other is the revelation that China has nearly 250 gigawatts worth of new coal-fired power plants under development. And for reference, that's more than the entire existing fleet in the United States, the existing fleet in India. And these plants are supposed to last 20 to 30 years. I'm curious, how can we reconcile these two conflicting realities? But I'm also seeing a related question here from the audience. Hope Marshall, a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS and a former National Committee staff member, asks, experts like Barbara Finnemore claim that China is leading a global clean energy revolution. At the same time, China continues to lack implementation on many of its domestic climate-friendly policies. Does China have credibility on the international stage when it is having trouble solving its own environmental degradation issues at home?
Well, that's a great question. But first of all, we don't want to confuse China's pollution control with its, efforts to work with, other countries to address the climate change agenda, right? Because, there's connections between the two, but we know that the six most common, these pollutants, right? They include ozone, right? Carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, and particular matter like PM 2.5, they are not considered greenhouse gases, right? Even though they're considered pollutants. But these two are closely interlinked. In fact, China, I think under President Xi, they used that pollution control agenda act strategically to push for the emission control agenda. That was one of the reasons that this primary cause of the air pollution is the burning of fossil fuels, right? That is also, we know that fossil fuel is also considered a major contributor to climate change, right? So China's efforts to clean up the environment also can contribute to the international efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas effects, right? So I think well, under President Xi, the political power has been so centralized. I think again, government officials have strong incentives to jump onto President Xi's policy bandwagon, right, in order to minimize the political risk, be rewarded as an early and enthusiastic supporter of his policy agenda. So as long as the leaders, right, remain committed to the environmental policy agenda, right, this brazen disobedience or food dragoning should be rare, right? Well, that being said, I think the issue is whether this policy will sustain in the long run. Right? There are basically two problems here. Well, the first problem is about policy coherence, right? This over-reliance on the mobilization or campaign-based approach hinders the growth of a stable rule of law-based enforcement mechanism that we believe are essential for pursuing long-term policy effectiveness. So in the absence of rule of law, authoritarian rulers have the final say, but their policy agenda continue to shift, right? That makes it difficult to sustain a coherent agenda, on issues like climate change, right? And also, remember that when President Xi announced that that China is going to be carbon neutral by 2060, right? We talk about this is going to be in 40 years, right? President Xi may not permanently stay in power, although theoretically and now legally that's doable. But even so, he may not commit to his policy agenda. Leaders themselves may disagree with each other on the policy priorities. That may contribute to the selective action, selective implementation problems at the local level. Right, when local government officials themselves may have more leeway in pursue their favored policies that may not be environmental protection, right? And second, I think those politically charged campaigns, they typically serve short-term goals, right? So Beijing will continue to face this major challenge in sustaining their gains that already achieved during those campaigns. We talk about how we have seen more coal-fired power plants being continued to be constructed. Even though China is talking about making China carbon neutral by 2060, right? But just the campaign themselves, right? They're not sustainable. Very often, the end of a given campaign is followed by a return to business as usual because it was simply impossible to achieve fundamental change in local bureaucrats or local implementers' policy behavior. Right, and that's such a short period of time. But that being said, that I found there's a new development now, is that it seems that Chinese leaders now are determined to beat the odds by institutionalizing and routinizing their new mobilization approach, just like what they did, but there was very rarely did in the case of population control, right? So we saw that in the China's efforts to maintain the zero COVID infections, right? We have seen that in their efforts to maintain this blue skies, right, in the reduction of PM 2.5. So through this institutionalized mobilization, the central government they may still, right, they have a chance, right, to improve accountability, and to align bureaucratic behavior patterns with leaders' policy preferences in the long run. But even that has its own shortcomings, because again, government officials typically accountable to their immediate superiors, they're inclined to undertake heavy-handed, sometimes even unscientific measures, to meet those benchmarks set in those high-power, politically charged campaigns, and also those, at all cost, by all means approaches in order to meet the policy targets are based on administrative fight, not on rule of law or the active participation of the civil society. So there's unintended consequences. So that would continue, I believe, to haunt the government policymakers in the policy process.
Thank you. We have a question from Teresa Poor, the Raymond C. Offenheiser Fellow at Oxfam America. She asks, is the state of China's environmental health a cause for concern as China exports its model of economic success to other developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative? Is BRI simply China passing the buck and its pollution problem to other countries?
Well, that is indeed, I think that's a great question. That's indeed a concern. When I was doing interviews, someone mentioned to me that told her that this one of the vice provincial governor in China said, "Don't worry about pollution here. Like in decades, it's all going to end up in Africa." So so there's this concerns that this Belt and Road Initiative, which is focused on those construction of the big infrastructure projects, the cement, the steel, right? It's the way, sort of like used like a Trojan horse for China to outsource the pollution, to other countries, especially in countries, that have, lax regulations on environment, on pollution, right? Countries in Central Asia, maybe also in sub-Saharan Africa. But in the meantime, it seems that the Chinese government also emphasized the importance of the green development, right, in terms of investing in those projects. So I hope they mean it, but so far we don't have any evidence to support that indeed, China's investment in those countries, the Belt and Road countries, have led to worsen the problems, the environment in those countries.
We have a question from David Peets at the University of Arizona. He says, I hope this is a fair question. You focused on air pollution. Is there any reason to believe that the dynamics of the administrative process you described and their outcomes have been different in the water sector? And I'll add also soil as well. I'm curious to add on to this, if the focus in China on air pollution has taken any resources away from the other two pollution problems.
Well, that is another great question, right? When you look at those action plans, the first action plan tackles the pollution, right? The air pollution problem. That after all, right, it's the one of the major concerns as far as the environmental health is concerned. In fact, the pollution caused 1.8 million deaths, in China. Most of that is caused by air pollution, right? The others is caused by water pollution and soil pollution, right? After 2013, China has kicked off those action plans, to fix the water problem and then the soil contamination problem. It has made some progress. Supposedly that by the end of 2020, there were going to have 70% of China's waterways being meeting the government mandated the targets in terms of the usability, safety of their water. But so far we haven't had any systematic data to assess or evaluate the policy effectiveness. They have indeed introduced the so-called river chiefs system, for example, again, to institutionalize those campaigns, improve the government accountability in improving water quality. As far as the soil pollution is concerned, we know that is a big problem. It's also a major contributor to the food safety problem in the country. I just published a piece in South China Morning Post magazine about the issue, which is adapted from the book. But they have conducted a study in 2000 and released that some of the results in 2014, although much remains to be known. Still, including the water issue, the quality, how serious the pollution is, remains a state secret. And I heard they have launched another survey on China's soil pollution problem, but so far we haven't heard anything about what's the status of that survey, whether they have completed, and if so, when they're going to unveil the results. So time will tell.
Thanks, Yanzhong. Phil Alford at Harvard Law School asks, can you say more about the alignment of bureaucratic incentives with post-2012 policies and laws? Are economic growth and political stability still much more important than environmental issues in cadre evaluation?
Well, yeah, I think a good question. I think, well, these two objectives, certainly are not, conflicting with each other, right? In fact, if you read the chapter, chapter 3, I think chapter 2 of the book, when we talk about the impacts on the economy, the society, and the foreign policy and the polity, I have a section focused on how those environmental health issues themselves are a major concern for social and political stability. In fact, we have the data suggesting that people's complaints, petitions increased significantly since 2001 or 2002. They have also a lot of those so-called mass incidents associated with the environmental caused health problems. So it become now like a separate category for those mass incidents. So the government indeed have strong incentives, to fix the pollution because of its profound implications for social political stability.
We are almost out of time here. So Yanzhong, I just want to ask you one quick question. Do you expect your book, which is quite critical, to be translated into Chinese? And in addition to this, do you anticipate any issues when you next return to China to work on your new projects?
Well, again, I'm a scholar, right? I think it's not the scholar's job, right, to have a political agenda, to criticize simply for purpose of criticizing, right? It's my job to tell the truth, to provide balanced analytical approaches, to even controversial issues. And in fact, I hope, right, the government will take this not, like a criticism from an activist. It's I hope they take it as constructive critique from a scholar. In fact, my experience, especially over the past month, as far as the China's COVID control is concerned, it seems that the government is indeed, they are learning. They are even willing to take the independent perspectives, including criticisms, and incorporate it in their policy process. So that I think gives me hope, right? That they will find this book hopefully useful.
I sure hope so too. Yanzhong, thank you so much for the excellent conversation. And Thanks to our audience for tuning in today and sending in such engaging questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to more of them, but I hope we've piqued your interest enough to go out and get your own copy of the book if you're looking for more answers. Again, this is Toxic Politics. I believe we sent a link in the chat where you can purchase it. I want to thank my colleagues, Margot, Erica, and Bernice for helping to make this program happen from behind the scenes. And of course, Yanzhong, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.